Chapter 22 of Just David by Eleanor H. Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, As Perry Saw It. One by one the days passed, and there came from the anxious watchers at David's bedside only the words, "There's very little change." Often Jack Guernsey went to the farmhouse to inquire for the boy. Often, too, he saw Perry Larson, and Perry was never loath to talk of David. It was from Perry, indeed, that Guernsey began to learn some things of David that he had never known before. "It does beat all," Perry Larson said to him one day. "How many folks asks me how that boy is. Folks that you'd never think knew him, anyhow, to say nothing of caring whether he lived or died. Now there's old Miss Summers, for instance. You know what she is. Sour as a lemon and puckery as a chokecherry. Well, if she didn't give me yesterday a great bouquet of posies she'd growed herself, and said they was for him, that they belonged to him anyhow. Of course, I didn't exactly sense what she meant by that, so I asked her straight out. And it seems that somehow, when the boy first come, he struck her place one day and spied a great big red rose on one of her bushes. It seems he had his fiddle, and he played it, that rose a-growing, you know his way. And she heard and spoke up pretty sharp, and asked him what in time he was doing. Well, most kids would 'a' run, knowing her temper as they does, but not much David. He stands up as pert as you please, and tells her how happy that red rose must be to make all that dreary garden look so pretty. And then he goes on, merry as a lark, a-playin' down the hill. Well, Miss Summers owned up to me that she was pretty mad at the time, 'cause her garden did look like tunket, and she knew it. She said she hadn't cared to do a thing with it since her Bessie died that thought so much of it. But after what David has said, even mad as she was, the thing kind of got on her nerves, and she couldn't see a thing, day or night, but that red rose a-growing there so pert and courageous like, until at last, just to quiet herself, she fairly had to set in and slick that garden up. She said she raked and weeded and fixed up all the plants there was in good shape, and then she sent down to the junction for some all growed in pots, 'cause 'twas too late to plant seeds. And now it's doing beautiful, so she just couldn't help sending them posies to David. When I told Miss Holly, she said she was glad it happened, 'cause what Miss Summer needed was something to get her out of herself. And I'm free to say she did look better natured, and no mistake, kind of like a chokeberry in blossom, you might say. And then there's the Widder Glaspell," continued Perry after a pause. "Course anyone would expect she'd feel bad, seeing as how good David was to her boy, teaching him to play, you know. But Miss Glaspell says Joe just does take on something terrible, and he won't tech the fiddle, though he was plumb carried away with it when David was well and teaching of him. And there's the Clark kid. He's lame, you know, and he thought the world and all of David's playing. Course there's you and Miss Holbrook, always asking and sending things, but that ain't so strange, 'cause you was specially his friends. But it's them others what beats me. Why, some days it's most every soul I meet just asking how he is, and saying they hopes he'll get well. Sometimes it's kids that he's played to, and I'll be triggered if one of 'em one day didn't have no excuse to offer, except that David had fit him, 'bout a cat or something, and that ever since then he'd thought a heap of him, though he guessed David didn't know it. Listen to that, will you? And once a woman held me up and took on terrible, but all I could get from her was that he'd sat on her doorstep and played to her baby once or twice, as if that was anything. But one of the derndest funny ones was the woman who said she could wash her dishes a sight easier after she'd seed him a-going by playing. There was Bill Dowd, too. You know he really has got a screw loose in his head somewheres, and there ain't anyone but what says he's a town fool all right. Well, what do you think he said?" Mr. Jack shook his head. "Well, he said he done hope as how nothing would happen to that boy, 'cause he did so like to see him smile, and that he always did smile every time he met him. There, what do you think of that?" "Well, I think, Perry," returned Mr. Jack soberly, that Bill Dowd wasn't playing the fool when he said that, quite so much as he sometimes is, perhaps. Maybe not, murmured Perry Larson perplexedly. Still, I'm free to say I do think 'twas kind of queer. He paused, then slapped his knee suddenly. Say, did I tell you about Streeter, old Bill Streeter and the pear tree? Again Mr. Jack shook his head. Well, then I'm going to, declared the other with gleeful emphasis. And say, I don't believe even you can explain this. I don't. Well, you know Streeter. Everyone does. So I ain't saying nothing slanderous. He was cut on a bias, and that bias runs to money every time. You know as well as I do that he won't lift his finger unless there's a dollar sticking to it, and that he hain't no use for anything nor anybody unless there's money in it for him. I'm blamed if I don't think that if he ever gets to heaven, he'll pluck his own wings and sell the feathers for what they'll bring. Oh, Perry, remonstrated Mr. Jack in a half-stifled voice. Perry Larson only grinned and went on imperturbably. Well, seeing as we both understand what he is, I'll tell you what he done. He called me to his fence one day, big as life, and says he, "How's the boy?" And you could have knocked me down with a feather. Streeter, I asked him how a boy was that was sick, and he seemed to care, too. I hain't seen him look so long-faced since he was paid up on a sartin note I knows of, just as he was smacking his lips over a nice fat farm that was coming to him. Well, I was that plumb puzzled that I meant to find out why Streeter was taking such notice if I hung for it. So I set to on a little detective work on my own, knowing, of course, that 'twa'n't no use asking of him himself. Well, and what do you suppose I found out? If that little scamp of a boy hadn't even got round him, Streeter, the skinflint, he had, and he went there often, the neighbors said, and Streeter doted on him. They declared that actually he gave him a cent once, though that part I ain't swallering yet. They said, the neighbors did, that it all started from the pear tree, the big one to the left of his house. Maybe you remember it. Well, anyhow, it seems that it's old and through bearing any fruit, though it still blossoms fit to kill every year, only a little late, most always, and the blossoms stay on longer 'n common, as if they knew there wasn't nothing doing later. Well, old Streeter said it had got to come down. I reckon he suspected it of swiping some of the sunshine, or maybe a little rain that belonged to the trees t'other side of the road, what did bear fruit and was worth something. Anyhow, he got his man and his axe and was plumb ready to start in when he sees David, and David sees him. 'Twas when the boy first come. He'd gone to walk and had struck this pear tree all in bloom, and of course you know how the boy would act. A pear tree bloomin' is a likely sight, I'll own. He danced and laughed and clapped his hands. He didn't have his fiddle with him, and carried on like all possessed. Then he sees the man with the axe, and Streeter sees him. They said it was rich then. Bill Warner heard it all from t'other side of the fence. He said David, when he found out what was going to happen, went clear crazy, and rampaged on at such a rate that old Skeeter couldn't do nothing but stand and stare until he finally managed to growl out, "But I tell you, boy, the tree ain't no use no more." Bill says the boy flew all to pieces then. "No use? No use?" he cries. "Such a perfectly beautiful thing as that no use? Why, it don't have to be any use when it's so pretty. It's just to look at and love and be happy with." Fancy saying that to old Streeter. I'd like to seen his face. But Bill says that weren't half what the boy said. He declared that 'twas God's present, anyhow, that trees was, and that the things he gave us to look at was just as much use as the things he gave us to eat, and that the stars and the sunsets and the snowflakes and the little white cloud boats and I don't know what all was just as important in the orchestra of life as turnips and squashes. And then, Billy says, he ended by just flinging himself onto Streeter and begging him to wait till he could go back and get his fiddle so he could tell him what a beautiful thing that tree was. Well, if you believe it, old Streeter was so plumb befuzzled he sent the man and the axe away. And that tree's a livin' terday, 'tis, he finished. Then, with a sudden gloom on his face, Larson added huskily, "And I only hope I'll be saying the same thing of that boy come next month at this time." "We'll hope you will," sighed the other fervently. And so, one by one, the days passed, while the whole town waited, and while, in the great airy parlor bedroom of the Holly farmhouse, one small boy fought his battle for life. Then came the blackest day and night of all, when the town could only wait and watch. It had lost its hope. When the doctors shook their heads and refused to meet Mrs. Holly's eyes, when the pulse in the slim wrist outside the coverlet played hide and seek with the cool, persistent fingers that sought so earnestly for it, when Perry Larson sat for uncounted sleepless hours by the kitchen stove and fearfully listened for a step crossing the hallway, when Mr. Jack on his porch and Miss Holbrook in her tower window went with David down into the dark valley and came so near the rushing river that life, with its pretty prides and prejudices, could never seem quite the same to them again. Then, after that blackest day and night, came the dawn, as the dawns do come after the blackest of days and nights. In the slender wrist outside the coverlet the pulse gained and steadied. On the forehead beneath the nurse's fingers a moisture came. The doctors nodded their heads now and looked every one straight in the eye. "He will live," they said. "The crisis is past." Out by the kitchen stove, Perry Larson heard the step cross the hall and sprang upright. But at the first glimpse of Mrs. Holly's tear-wet yet radiant face, he collapsed limply. "Gosh!" he muttered. "Say, do you know, I didn't suppose I did care so much. I reckon I'll go and tell Mr. Jack. He'll want to hear." End of chapter 22.